The cursor blinked, a tiny rhythmic heartbeat on a dead screen. For the last hour, that was all the progress I'd made. The billion-dollar tech campus visualization, the one that was supposed to be my masterpiece, was now just a collection of ghost white polygons and shattered render nodes. The client had pulled the plug. Weeks of 16-hour days, of existing on stale coffee and the hum of my workstation, all evaporated into a single sterile email. My name is Arthur Finch. I build worlds that don't exist, and tonight, my own world felt like it was about to be uninstalled. I needed to get out. The air in my Denver loft was thick with the smell of failure. Driving was the only thing that ever cleared my head, a mindless task of asphalt and lane lines. My sedan's gas light had been on for 2 days, a tiny amber beacon of neglect. I found myself pulling off the highway onto a frontage road, the city lights shrinking in my rearview mirror until I was left with the lonely glow of a single station. Pioneer Gas. It was one of those 24/7 outposts that seemed to exist in a pocket of forgotten time, its sign buzzing like a dying insect. 6 of the 7 pumps were vacant, shimmering under the harsh fluorescent canopy. I pulled up to the one closest to the convenience store, the engine sighing as I cut the power. Inside, the store was a shrine to late-night desperation. The coffee was burnt. The hot dogs looked mummified, but it was a pocket of light in the darkness. I grabbed a large black coffee, paid the bored-looking kid behind the counter, and walked back out into the chilly Colorado night. That's when I saw him. He was standing by the driver's side door of my car, a silhouette against the pump's light. As I got closer, the details sharpened. He was old, thin, but with a wiry strength coiled in his frame, like old rope. He wore a faded denim jacket over a plaid shirt, his face a road map of wrinkles. But it was his eyes that stopped me cold. They were a pale, washed-out blue, yet they drilled into me with an intensity that felt physical. "You need to move," he said. His voice was quiet, a low, gravelly rumble. It wasn't a request. I stopped a few feet away, my coffee cup warming my hand. "Excuse me?" "My spot," he said, gesturing with a slight nod toward the ground where my car was parked. "You took my spot. You should have known to leave it." I glanced around at the sea of empty pumps, the painted numbers gleaming on the concrete. A bubble of irritation, born from the day's frustrations, rose in my chest. "Pal, look around. There are 6 other spots. Take your pick." I tried to sidestep him to get to my door. He didn't move. He was like a statue carved from weathered wood. "It's not about the gas," he said, his pale eyes unblinking. "It's not just a spot. It's the spot. A place of balance. You upset it." This was the last thing I needed. Some local lunatic with a thing for gas pumps. "Listen, I've had a really long day," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "I don't have time for this. If you don't mind, I'd like to go home." "Some people," he said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming a rasp, "spend their whole lives looking over their shoulder, checking, making sure that little patch of darkness is still trailing behind them. It's the only proof they have that they're really there, that they cast a pall on the world." The words were so strange, so specific, that they cut through my annoyance. "What are you talking about? You cling to your shadow as proof you exist," he whispered, taking a half-step closer. The air grew colder. "But what if it decided you weren't worth following anymore? What if it left you?" "You're insane," I spat, the stress of the day finally boiling over. "Get away from my car before I call the cops, you crazy old bastard." The man's face, already a mask of wrinkles, hardened into something like stone. The fiery intensity in his eyes turned to ice. He didn't flinch at my insult. He just stared, as if seeing something deep inside me that I didn't know was there. He reached a gnarled hand into the pocket of his denim jacket and pulled out a pinch of something. It looked like fine, gray dust, almost like ash. He held it on his palm for a second, his lips moving silently. Then he blew. The dust didn't scatter. It didn't puff into a cloud. It shot forward in a tight spectral stream, and then simply vanished an inch from my face. I felt nothing, not a grain of grit, but an inexplicable, profound chill washed over me. His voice was a dry crackle of leaves. He said something I couldn't quite make out, a string of guttural, unfamiliar syllables, but the last few words were as clear as a funeral bell. May your footprint fade from the light, and may the emptiness that follows come to claim you. With that, he turned, his movement stiff and deliberate. He walked over to a rusted-out old Ford pickup truck, the kind of vehicle held together by little more than rust and memory. The engine turned over with a protesting groan, and he drove off into the darkness, his taillights disappearing without a trace. I stood there for a full minute, my heart hammering against my ribs. The coffee in my hand had gone cold. I brushed at my jacket, a reflexive, useless gesture. The encounter left a vile, sticky film on my mind. A city eccentric, I told myself. A nut job. That's all it was. I got in my car, locked the doors, and peeled out of the Pioneer gas station, forcing the image of those pale blue eyes from my mind. Later that night, I met my friend Leo at a downtown bar, hoping a few beers would sand down the rough edges of the day. Leo Maxwell and I went way back. He was a structural engineer, a man who believed in load-bearing walls and verifiable data. He was the perfect antidote to my abstract, digital world. I told him about the contract, but I left out the part about the old man. How do you tell your most logical friend that you think you've been cursed by a gas station wizard? Walking home a few hours later, the city felt different. The alcohol had created a pleasant buzz, but a deeper unease remained. I turned onto my street, a quiet lane lined with old brick townhouses. A new, high-intensity LED streetlight had just been installed, and it cast a brilliant, sterile white circle on the sidewalk. As I walked into its glare, I stumbled, my brain short-circuiting for a second. The light was so bright it bleached the color from the brickwork and turned the asphalt a pale gray. It illuminated me from head to toe. And behind me, there was nothing. The pavement was perfectly, uniformly lit. There was no elongated silhouette, no dark shape stretching out from my heels. I stopped, dead still, directly under the light. I held up my hand. The light hit my skin, but the pavement below remained barren. I blinked hard, shaking my head. Too much bourbon, Finch, I muttered aloud. It had to be. An optical illusion. A weird angle. I was drunk. But as I stood there, swaying slightly, a sliver of ice-cold fear, more real and sober than anything I'd felt all day, slid into my heart. I sprinted the rest of the way to my front door, not daring to look back. I woke up to the familiar, punishing throb of a hangover, but it was accompanied by a new sensation, a low, humming dread. The memory of the streetlight was hazy, dreamlike, the kind of distorted recollection you get from a night of heavy drinking. I tried to dismiss it, to bury it under the mundane routine of a Saturday morning. I made coffee, the gurgle of the machine a comforting, normal sound. I shuffled through my apartment, keeping to the dimmer parts of the rooms, a subconscious avoidance I didn't question until I found myself pressed against the far wall of the kitchen, avoiding a sunbeam that sliced across the floor. Why was I doing that? The question hung in the air, heavy and unwelcome. The logical part of my brain, the architect who relied on rules and physics, was at war with the terrified man who'd sprinted home last night. This was stupid. It was paranoia. I had to prove it to myself. I had to see the shadow and put this madness to rest. My hands were trembling as I walked to the large bay window in my living room. The morning sun was bright, pouring through the glass and casting a sharp, angular pattern of the window frame onto the hardwood floor. Taking a deep breath, I extended my right hand and held it in the beam of light. I stared at the floor. The shadow of the mullions was crisp and clear, a dark grid on the sun-drenched oak. The light hit my hand, illuminating the fine hairs on my knuckles, the lines on my palm. But on the floor, where the shadow of my hand should have been, there was only light. The grid of the window frame was unbroken. My breath hitched. My heart didn't just drop. It plummeted, a stone in a bottomless well. I pulled my hand back as if the light had burned it. I tried again, my left hand this time. Nothing. I waved it back and forth. The dust motes dancing in the sunbeam swirled and eddied, but the floor remained stubbornly, impossibly, shadowless. Panic, cold and sharp, seized me. This wasn't a drunken hallucination. This was real. I had to get outside. I had to see it in the open, under the sky. Maybe it was something about the window glass, some bizarre refraction. My mind scrabbled for any rational explanation, no matter how flimsy. I threw on a jacket and burst out of my apartment building onto the street. A wave of relief washed over me. The sky was overcast, a uniform blanket of gray. The light was diffuse, directionless. Shadows were faint, soft-edged smudges at the base of trees and cars. Nothing looked out of place. I could almost breathe again. It was a trick of the light. It had to be. And then, as if on cue, a gust of wind tore a hole in the clouds. The brilliant high-altitude Colorado sun blazed down, instantly sharpening the world into a high-contrast image. The shadow of the building behind me became a hard, dark line on the pavement. The shadow of a nearby fire hydrant was a stark, squat shape. With a sense of mounting, sickening dread, I slowly turned around. I looked at the spot on the sidewalk directly behind me. It was clean, empty. A perfect, sun-bleached patch of concrete where my dark twin should have been. I was a hole in the world. A man-shaped object that didn't obey the most fundamental law of light. The panic returned, a tidal wave this time. My lungs felt tight, my vision tunneled. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers feeling clumsy and numb. I scrolled to one name, Leo Maxwell. He answered on the third ring. "Hey, Art, you recover from last night?" "Leo," I gasped, my voice thin and reedy. "Leo, I need you to meet me, right now." "Whoa, easy there. What's wrong? You sound like you just saw a ghost." "Worse," I choked out. "Much, much worse. Can you meet me at Wash Park? The big meadow by the boathouse, please." The raw hysteria in my voice must have cut through his weekend calm. Okay, I'm on my way. 20 minutes. Are you all right?" "No," I said, and hung up. We met on the vast open lawn of the park. Families were flying kites, kids were kicking soccer balls, the very picture of Saturday normalcy. It made what I was about to do feel even more insane. Leo approached, a look of genuine concern on his face. He was wearing a Boulder Engineering sweatshirt, a solid, reassuring presence. "Arthur, talk to me. What the hell is going on?" he asked, putting a hand on my shoulder. I couldn't form the words. "Just come over here," I said, leading him to the middle of the field, far from any trees that might complicate the light. The sun was high and unforgiving. "Okay, we're here. Now what?" he asked, his skepticism starting to show. He probably thought I was having a breakdown over the lost contract. I positioned myself so the sun was directly at my back and pointed. "Look," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Leo looked down. He saw his own shadow, a clear, dark shape stretched out on the green grass. Then his eyes moved to the space beside it, where my shadow should have been. He frowned. "What am I looking at?" "Look at me, Leo. Now look at the ground behind me." He did. He looked from my sunlit face to the empty grass at my feet, then back to his own shadow. The gears were turning in his analytical engineer's mind. He squinted, shaded his eyes, and took a step to the side as if to check the angle of the sun. Nothing changed. I was an object in three-dimensional space, bathed in light. Yet I produced no corresponding area of darkness. The change on his face was gradual and terrifying to watch. The skepticism melted away, replaced by profound confusion. The confusion gave way to wide-eyed disbelief, and finally, the disbelief curdled into raw, undiluted fear. "No," he breathed, shaking his head. "No, that's not possible." He walked a slow circle around me, his eyes locked on the ground. He reached out and touched my arm, his fingers pressing into my jacket as if to confirm I was solid, real. "This is a trick," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Some kind of light-bending fabric? A projection?" "It's not a trick, Leo," I said, my voice breaking. He stared at me, his face pale. He wasn't looking at a friend who was playing a prank. He was looking at a man who had casually, inexplicably, broken a law as fundamental as gravity. He was seeing the impossible made real, and it shook him to his very core. I went home and locked the door. The image of the fear in my best friend's eyes burned into my memory. The world outside my window felt alien and hostile. I collapsed onto my couch, the full weight of my new reality crashing down on me. I was unmoored, disconnected. In a desperate, frantic surge, I grabbed my laptop. I typed, my fingers flying across the keys. "Man without a shadow. Lost my shadow. Shadow mythology curse." The search results were a cascade of uselessness. German fairy tales about a man named Peter Schlemiel who sold his shadow to the devil. Children's stories, vague folklore, nothing real, nothing scientific, nothing that could help. And then, like a photograph developing in a dark room, the memory surfaced. The cold night air, the smell of gasoline, the pale, piercing eyes of the old man at Pioneer Gas. Silas, I thought, the name popping into my head, though I had no idea how I knew it. His words echoed in my mind, no longer the ramblings of a madman, but a prophecy that had come to pass. May your footprint fade from the light. He did this to me. He had reached into the machinery of the universe and flipped a switch with my name on it. And I had no idea how to flip it back. My first instinct was to fight magic with magic. It was a desperate, illogical leap for a man who designed buildings based on stress tolerances and material specifications. But logic had abandoned me on the sun-drenched grass of Washington Park. My search for answers became a bizarre pilgrimage into Denver's occult underbelly. I found myself in dimly lit back rooms that smelled of incense and patchouli, explaining my predicament to people with names like Stardust and Brother Sage. The reactions were always the same. They'd begin with a patronizing, all-knowing smile, assuming I was speaking metaphorically about a spiritual malaise. Then I would stand under a bare light bulb, and the smiles would vanish. A woman who called herself a channeler took one look at the vacant floor behind me and literally shrieked, scrambling backward and making a sign with her hands. She accused me of being a void walker, a hollow man, and refused to be in the same room. A self-proclaimed paranormal investigator brought a collection of EMF meters and thermal cameras. The meters remained silent, but he claimed the spot where my shadow should have been was a full 5 degrees colder than the surrounding air. He packed his gear and left without another word, his face ashen. Most of them recoiled in fear, seeing not a man in need of help, but a terrifying omen. I was an anomaly they had no spell for. Leo, meanwhile, was tackling the problem from his own angle. Unable to accept a supernatural cause, he believed it had to be a new, undocumented scientific phenomenon. "There's a physical reason for this, Art," he insisted over the phone, his voice strained with worry. "We just don't know what it is yet." In a misguided attempt to help, he mentioned my situation to a cousin of his who worked as a producer for a local news channel. He framed it as a hypothetical, a friend of a friend situation, hoping to get a lead on a physicist or an optics specialist who might be interested. That was the spark that lit the forest fire. The producer, a man named Rick with a shark-like smile and an insatiable appetite for ratings, didn't see a scientific puzzle. He saw the story of a lifetime. He hounded Leo until he finally gave him my number. Rick called me, his voice a slick blend of sympathy and excitement. He promised anonymity, a blurred face, a distorted voice. "We just want to help you find answers, Mr. Finch," he cooed. "Think of the experts that might see this. Someone out there might have a clue." I was drowning, and he was offering a life raft, even if I knew it was probably riddled with holes. I agreed. The interview was brief, filmed in a darkened studio. I was a silhouette against a bright screen, an irony that wasn't lost on me. I told my story focusing on the phenomenon, leaving out the part about Silas and the curse. It felt too insane to say out loud on camera. The segment aired on the 10 o'clock news. The Shadowless Man of Denver, they called me. It was supposed to be a local curiosity piece. Within 12 hours, it was national news. By the end of the day, it was global. The clip went viral. Someone created the hashtag #ShadowlessMan, and it exploded across social media. My promised anonymity lasted for approximately 16 hours. One of the psychics I'd visited, eager for his 15 minutes of fame, called the news station and gave them my name and address. The world descended on my doorstep. When I looked out my window the next morning, my quiet street looked like a presidential motorcade had crashed. News vans from every major network were double parked, their satellite dishes aimed at the sky. Reporters with microphones and cameramen with heavy rigs were camped out on my lawn, a frantic, chattering horde. Every time I moved past a window, a dozen cameras flashed. My phone rang incessantly with unknown numbers from all over the world. Leo helped me create a composite sketch of Silas from my memory. The gaunt face, the stringy hair, the faded jacket, and those haunting pale eyes. The sketch was broadcast everywhere. Police searching for mystery man in connection with shadowless phenomenon. But it was hopeless. No one remembered the license plate of his beat-up Ford pickup. The security cameras at Pioneer Gas, it turned out, were ancient, low-resolution models that had been recording over the same tape for a decade. The footage was a blurry, useless soup. Silas had vanished as completely as my shadow. I became a prisoner in my own home. The constant scrutiny was a physical weight. Every lens felt like an accusation, every shouted question a reminder of my freakishness. The sensation of lightness I'd occasionally felt had become a constant. It was a subtle, unnerving feeling of being untethered, as if my connection to the ground, my very anchor in reality, had been frayed. Sometimes I'd take a step and feel for a microsecond like I might just float away. The scientific community went into a frenzy. Theories sprouted like weeds. It was a localized quantum distortion. It was a unique biological property that caused my body to perfectly absorb and re-emit photons. It was a form of mass hysteria, though the crystal-clear video evidence quickly debunked that. I was no longer Arthur Finch, architect. I was Specimen A, the most profound and terrifying mystery on the planet. After a week of this siege, when my food was running low and my sanity was hanging by a thread, they came. They didn't knock. A single crisp rap on the door cut through the din of the reporters outside. I looked through the peephole and saw two people in plain, dark suits, a man and a woman. They showed no emotion, no curiosity. I opened the door a crack. "We're not press," the man said, his voice calm and authoritative. "My name is Agent Thorne. We're with a research group. We'd like to talk." He slid a black business card through the opening. It was heavy, matte finish cardstock. It read, ARC Anomalous Reality Command Division of Research and Containment. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "The same thing you want, Mr. Finch," the woman said, her eyes meeting mine. "Answers. And we have the resources to find them. We can offer you protection, privacy, and the best scientific minds in the world, all focused on your situation. All we ask for is your cooperation." They were offering me an escape. A gilded cage, perhaps, but a cage was better than this open-air zoo. I looked past them at the rabid pack of reporters. I felt the strange, floating sensation in my feet. I was out of options. My old life was gone. "Okay," I said, opening the door wider. "I'll go." The transition was seamless and unnervingly efficient. I walked out my back door, was ushered into a black SUV with tinted windows, and driven to a private airfield. The next thing I knew, I was watching the geometric patterns of civilization give way to the vast, beige emptiness of the Nevada desert. The ARC facility wasn't visible from the air. We landed on a strip that seemed to appear out of the heat haze, and an elevator I hadn't seen descended into the earth. The complex was less a bunker and more a subterranean metropolis of science. Gleaming white corridors, silent magnetic levitation carts, and air that tasted sterile and recycled. It was the architectural opposite of my cozy Denver loft, and it felt like being inside one of my own sterile, unlived-in renderings. They called my new home the Habitation Module. It was a comfortable, if Spartan, suite of rooms, but one room was different. They called it the Aperture, or more informally, the Light Box. It was a perfect 20 by 20 foot cube. The walls, ceiling, and floor were made of a seamless matte white material. There were no corners, only gentle curves, creating an infinite, disorienting space. Embedded in the surfaces were hundreds of adjustable, high-intensity light panels. It was a room designed for one purpose: to leave no place for a shadow to hide, a fact that was now a source of profound cosmic irony. This room would be the stage for my strange affliction. I was introduced to the team. The head of the project, designated Project Echo, was Dr. Alistair Graves. He was a man who seemed to be assembled from sharp angles and quiet intensity. His eyes, unlike Silas's, weren't pale, but they held a similar unnerving focus, the gaze of a man who would disassemble a miracle to see how it ticked. He was a physicist. His team consisted of a biologist, a neurologist, and a specialist in quantum mechanics. All brilliant, all male, all looking at me with the same detached, ravenous curiosity. The days settled into a routine of meticulous invasive study. They drew my blood, biopsied my tissue, mapped my genome. They bombarded me with every frequency of light, from deep infrared to harsh ultraviolet. They subjected me to powerful magnetic fields and low-level radiation. They were searching for the anomaly, the single errant line of code in my physical being that could explain the impossible. The results were maddeningly, consistently normal. My DNA was unremarkable. My tissues were healthy. My body interacted with every form of energy and radiation exactly as any other human body would, except for one glaring, universe-breaking exception. I was a perfectly normal man who, for reasons no science could explain, had ceased to cast a shadow. My only reprieve from the physical tests were my sessions with Dr. Samuel Kane, the project psychologist. He was a gentler man than the others, with a kind face and a calm demeanor. He was less interested in the how of my condition and more in the what it felt like. "Describe it for me, Arthur," he'd say in our sessions. "The feeling of emptiness you mentioned?" "It's not just seeing it," I'd try to explain, gesturing vaguely behind me. "It's a feeling, a tactile absence. You know when you're walking and you have that peripheral sense of your own shadow trailing you? It's like a phantom limb, but in reverse. I feel the space where it should be. It feels hollow. All the time, I have this subconscious urge to turn around, to check on something I feel like I've forgotten, something vital." To offset the staggering cost of the facility and to manage the still intense public fascination, ARC made a decision that turned my life into the ultimate reality show. They struck a multi-million-dollar deal with a global news network. With my reluctant, heavily compensated consent, they installed discrete, high-definition cameras in the light box and began a 24/7 live stream. The world could now watch the shadowless man in his white room eating, reading, and sleeping, all under the ceaseless, shadow-obliterating glare of the lights. I was a bug in a jar, and the entire planet was watching. Weeks bled into one another. The routine became a monotonous blur of tests and observation. I'd spend hours a day in the light box, sometimes just sitting on a chair in the center of the room while they calibrated the lights, my every non-shadowed move broadcast to millions. Graves and his team grew more frustrated. Their data yielded nothing but dead ends. The phenomenon was right in front of them, observable, repeatable, but utterly inexplicable. Graves started muttering about extra-dimensional topology and localized reality failings, terms that sounded more like science fiction than physics. Then, one night, something happened. They were running a test with high-frequency strobing lights, trying to catch the moment my shadow failed to appear on a sub-millisecond level. The flashes were dizzying, disorienting. Suddenly, in the midst of the flickering chaos, I felt it. A pocket of intense, biting cold bloomed in the far corner of the room. It was a cold that felt ancient and predatory. A wave of pure, unadulterated panic washed over me, so strong I nearly blacked out. "Stop!" I yelled, my voice cracking. "Stop the test!" They killed the strobes, returning the room to its normal, brilliant white. The feeling vanished as quickly as it had come. "What is it, Arthur?" Graves's voice came over the intercom, sharp and alert. "What did you feel?" "A cold spot," I stammered, my heart still racing. "Over there. And fear. I've never felt anything like it." The technicians checked their instruments. One of them called out, his voice tight with excitement. "Dr. Graves, look at this. Sensor 7 registered a transient temperature drop of almost 20 degrees Fahrenheit." and we got a simultaneous spike in the infrasonic range, just for a moment. Then nothing. They reviewed the camera footage. There was nothing to see. Just me, flinching in the strobing light. But the data was there. A measurable physical event that had no visible cause. Graves stared at the telemetry readouts, a new, darker intensity in his eyes. For the first time, he looked like a man who suspected the ghost he was hunting might actually be real. The incident was logged, filed away as Unexplained Environmental Anomaly E01. It was the first tremor before the earthquake. The live stream droned on, a testament to modern voyeurism. The initial global obsession had cooled to a simmer. I was no longer a breaking news story, but a piece of bizarre ambient television, the 21st century equivalent of a ship in a bottle. Viewership was still high, but the frenetic energy was gone. Inside the complex, however, the tension was coiling tighter. My uneventful existence was a constant, frustrating reminder of ARC's failure. Graves and his team were talking about more aggressive protocols, about reality resonance cascades, phrases that sounded both impressive and terrifyingly dangerous. I felt like a man strapped to a bomb while scientists argued about which color wire to cut. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in the light box for what they called a baseline observation period. It was code for sit on a chair and do nothing for 3 hours. The cameras were rolling, the lights were blazing, and millions of people were likely watching me sip a bottle of water out of sheer boredom. That's when I saw it. In the far corner of the room, the same spot where I'd felt the cold during the strobe test, the seamless white curve of the wall began to darken. It wasn't a shadow being cast. It was as if a bottle of black ink had been spilled inside the very material of the wall. The darkness pooled and then flowed, defying gravity, moving from the wall onto the floor. It was a viscous, living patch of night. The science team erupted in the control room. I could hear their muffled, frantic shouts through the observation window. The spill of darkness coalesced, pulling itself together, and then it shot across the floor toward me. It moved with silent, impossible speed, a predator made of pure void. I tried to scramble off the chair, but it was too fast. It reached my feet, and instead of passing by, it flowed up my legs, wrapping around my ankles. And then it stopped, settling on the floor behind me, stretching out in the glare of the lights. It was a perfect, dark silhouette of a man sitting in a chair. My shadow was back. The sensation was immediate and overwhelming. It was the opposite of the phantom limb. It was the feeling of a lost part of my soul snapping back into place. The unnerving lightness in my feet vanished, replaced by a profound sense of gravity, of being anchored. A wave of warmth and wholeness washed over me so intensely that I almost wept with relief. It was over. The curse was broken. But it wasn't. My relief lasted for less than a second. From the same corner where my shadow had emerged, a second blot of darkness bled into existence. This one, however, didn't seek an owner. It flowed onto the floor and rose, pulling itself into a three-dimensional shape that had no business existing. It was a shadow without a body. It was a wolf, or something that was meant to be a wolf, as imagined by a dying mind. It stood on 2 legs, impossibly tall and emaciated, its form flickering and wavering at the edges like heat haze. Its limbs were too long, ending in claws of pure darkness that seemed to tear at the light around them. Its head was an elongated, bestial snout, and though it had no eyes, I could feel its vacant, hungry gaze locked onto me. It was the tenebrous wolf, a thing of myth and nightmare-given form, a predator from the place my shadow had just escaped. My newfound shadow, my own returned darkness, shifted, It detached from the base of the chair and stood up on the floor, a two-dimensional man of night. It stood between me and the wolf. The two dark forms faced each other. They were perfectly silent, but the air in the light box crackled with a tension that was more powerful than any sound. The cameras captured them as they began to vibrate, to shimmer at different, conflicting frequencies. The edges of their forms blurred and warped, a silent, frantic conversation in a language of oscillating darkness. I was frozen in my chair, a spectator to a conflict I couldn't comprehend. My mind, which had just begun to celebrate its return to normalcy, was now screaming in a new and more profound kind of terror. This wasn't the absence of a natural law anymore. This was the introduction of a new, horrifying one. In the control room, Graves slammed his hand on a large red button. "Kill the public feed, now! Full internal lockdown." The live stream cut out across the globe, replaced by a bland technical difficulties screen. But it was too late. Millions, perhaps billions of people had just witnessed it. A man's shadow had poured out of a wall, followed by a monster made of living night. The footage was already copied, shared, and analyzed. My bizarre, passive anomaly had just escalated into undeniable, terrifying proof that we were not alone. And the thing that had come through was not friendly. The ARC facility went from a research lab to a military command center overnight. The public-facing pretense was dropped. The lockdown was absolute. The new focus of Project Echo was no longer me, but the silent, terrifying drama playing out on the floor and walls of the light box. Graves and his team swarmed the aperture with new equipment. High-frequency cameras designed to capture motion in picoseconds, hypersensitive acoustic sensors to listen for sounds beyond human hearing, arrays of lasers to measure the slightest distortion in the space between the two entities. At first, the relationship between my shadow and the wolf was baffling. They moved with a strange, unnerving synchronicity. When I shifted in my chair, my shadow mimicked the movement, and a moment later, the wolf would echo the same shift. When I paced the room, the two dark forms would pace with me, one tethered to my feet, the other a freelance horror trailing a few feet behind. Some of the younger scientists theorized they were companions, two beings from the same dimension who had traveled here together. It was Dr. Kane, the psychologist, who saw the truth. He spent hours watching the playback, not as a physicist looking at data, but as a man studying behavior. "You're all wrong," he announced during one of the tense, sleepless debriefings. He pointed to a frozen frame on the main screen. "Look at the positioning. Alistair, you see two shapes. I see a dynamic. The wolf is the predator. Arthur's shadow is the prey." He advanced the footage frame by frame. "Watch. The wolf is always trying to close the distance to flank. See that flicker? It's not communication, it's a lunge, a feint. And look at Arthur's shadow. It's always repositioning itself, keeping its back away from the wolf, keeping itself between the wolf and Arthur. It's not dancing with it. It's terrified. It's using Arthur as an anchor and a shield." Kane's words unlocked a new, terrifying dimension to my experience. I wasn't just a spectator, I was a participant. An empathic one. I began to feel what my shadow felt. When the tenebrous wolf's form would waver and drift closer, a jolt of pure primal terror would shoot through me, raising the hair on my arms and turning my blood to ice. When my shadow would deftly shift its position as I moved, mirroring my steps to put more distance between itself and the creature, I'd feel a fleeting, desperate sense of relief. My shadow, the simple patch of darkness I'd taken for granted my entire life, was locked in a constant, silent battle for its existence, and I was on the front lines of its fear. Dr. Graves, processing this new input, formulated a new, horrifying theory that he laid out for the team and for me. The old man's curse wasn't just a simple detachment, he explained, his voice grim, his eyes locked on the two-dimensional drama on the monitors. It was a banishment. He didn't just sever Arthur's connection to his shadow. He physically ejected it from our plane of reality into somewhere else. A shadow dimension, for lack of a better term. And in that ecosystem, my shadow was prey. It was hunted. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Somehow, fighting for its survival, it found its way back to its origin point, its anchor. You, Arthur. It fled back to our world. But the hunter followed the trail. The wolf came through right behind it. They decided to test the theory, to provoke a reaction. The scientists, with a cold, clinical detachment, programmed a sequence of sudden, chaotic lighting changes. The powerful panels in the light box began to flash and shift, throwing the shadows into sharp, distorted relief, elongating and shrinking them in a mad ballet. The effect was instantaneous and violent. Freed from the steady, predictable light, the wolf's shadow lunged. It was no longer a subtle feint, but a clear, vicious attack. It threw itself across the floor, a spear of absolute black, aiming for my shadow. On the wall, the silent drama became an open battle. My shadow, a dark mirror of my own panicked flinch, threw itself aside. The wolf's form slammed into the wall where my shadow had been a nanosecond before, leaving a momentary, rippling distortion in its wake. My shadow scrambled, its edges blurring with speed. The wolf was relentless, lunging again and again. They were two patches of darkness, one fighting with desperate defensive agility, the other with single-minded predatory hunger. A scream tore from my throat, raw and helpless. I was watching a part of myself, the dark echo of my own form, being savaged by a monster. And there was nothing I could do. I scrambled to my feet, trying to run, trying to intervene. I thrust my arm into the beam of light, hoping to physically block the attack. But my real physical body had no effect. The battle was not taking place in my world of flesh and bone. It was happening on a two-dimensional plane, a war fought with light and its absence. I was connected to it. I was the source of one of the combatants. But I was utterly, hopelessly powerless to stop it. The battle of the shadows became my life. Day and night, the silent, desperate struggle continued on the walls and floor of the light box. My waking hours were a nightmare of shared terror, and my sleep was filled with frantic dreams of being pursued through endless, flat landscapes by a ravenous darkness. I was a wreck, my nerves shredded, my body exhausted from the constant adrenaline dumps of a fight I wasn't physically fighting. I begged Graves and his team to do something, anything. They tried. They erected barriers of high-intensity laser light, hoping to corral the wolf. It passed through them as if they weren't there. They bombarded the room with specific sound frequencies, from ear-splitting shrieks to bone-rattling infrasound. The wolf's form wavered for a moment, then stabilized, unaffected. They tried generating powerful electromagnetic fields. Nothing. The creature was not of our physics. It was an idea of a predator, and you can't shoot an idea with a laser. Leo, my only link to the outside world, was eventually granted clearance to the facility. ARC's psychologists, namely Dr. Kane, had argued that my deteriorating mental state required the presence of a familiar, trusted face. Seeing Leo walk into the control room was like a gasp of fresh air after being underwater for a month. He stared at the monitors, his engineer's mind struggling to process the impossible sight of my shadow self locked in combat with a mythological beast. He watched for hours, silent and frowning, not like a scientist, but like a mechanic listening for a problem in an engine. "It copies you," he said, finally turning to me. "Every move you make, it makes exactly?" "We know that, Mr. Maxwell," Graves said dismissively. "It's a shadow. That's its function." "No, you don't get it," Leo insisted, his eyes bright with a sudden crazy idea. "It's a perfect reflection, not just of your shape, but of your actions. So, what if you were holding something? If the shadow is a reflection, Arthur, maybe you can give it a weapon by holding a real one." The scientists in the room exchanged skeptical glances. It was the logic of a child, of a fairy tale. But all their multi-billion-dollar science had failed. They had nothing to lose. They brought in a practice sword, a wooden bakken used for kendo training. It felt awkward and foreign in my hands. A security chief, a burly ex-Marine, spent a few minutes showing me the most basic defensive stances. "Just hold it steady. Keep it between you and the threat," he grunted. I walked back into the light box, my heart pounding. I held the wooden sword out in a clumsy guard position facing the wall where the battle was raging. And then I saw it. On the wall, clutched in the hand of my dark, two-dimensional doppelganger, was the perfect, featureless silhouette of a sword. A collective gasp went through the control room. As the tenebrous wolf lunged again, I instinctively jerked the wooden sword up to parry. My shadow self mirrored the motion. The silhouette of its blade met the wolf's attacking claw. There was no sound, but on the wall, the wolf's attack was turned aside. For the first time since this began, my shadow had not just dodged. It had fought back. A sliver of hope, the first I'd felt in weeks, ignited in my chest. This was the key. A new bizarre training regimen began. Guided by the ex-Marine over the intercom, I spent hours a day in the lightbox practicing basic sword movements. Lunge, parry, block. My muscles ached, my arms burned, but every clumsy swing I made was translated into a life-or-death struggle on the wall. I was a puppeteer in a war of shades, my physical exhaustion the price of my shadow's survival. For a few days it worked. My shadow, armed with its new weapon, was able to hold its own, turning back the wolf's relentless assaults. But the wolf was not a mindless beast. It was a predator, and predators adapt. It started to change its tactics. It became faster, its lunges more erratic and unpredictable. It would feint high and attack low. It began to anticipate my clumsy, telegraphed movements, dodging the shadow sword and striking from the side. The tide of the battle began to turn again. The shadow sword was no longer enough. "The weapon's form is too simple," one of the physicists exclaimed. "We need to give him something more advanced." They tried giving me other objects. A meticulously crafted, non-functional replica of a high-tech rifle. A plastic mold of a pistol. I held them, aimed them, mimed pulling the trigger. Nothing happened. My shadow held the corresponding shapes, but they were useless props. The shadow rifle didn't fire shadow bullets. "It's not the object," Kane said quietly from the back of the control room, his eyes on my face. "It's the intent, the will behind it. A gun is a complex machine. Arthur doesn't know how to will a bullet to fly. But a sword, a shield, a stick to beat back the dark, that's archetypal. It's primal. It's a pure extension of the will to defend oneself." He was right. The power wasn't in the object I held, but in the primitive, instinctual part of my brain that understood its purpose. And my limited modern man's understanding of combat was proving to be no match for a creature that was the very archetype of a predator. The wolf was learning faster than I was. My shadow was losing. I was fading. The relentless round-the-clock battle had hollowed me out, leaving a walking ghost in a high-tech prison. I barely ate. Sleep was a minefield of shared terror, and I'd often wake up screaming, the phantom sensation of the wolf's claws tearing at my shadow still lingering on my skin. I was a frayed electrical wire, sparking and close to snapping. Dr. Kane's daily reports to Graves were blunt. I was approaching total systemic collapse both physically and psychologically. My body was giving up. The final battle happened without ceremony. It was just another hour in another day of an endless war. I was on my feet in the light box, the wooden sword feeling like it weighed 100 pounds, my movements sluggish and weak. On the wall, my shadow self mirrored my exhaustion, its parries slow, its form seeming to waver with fatigue. The tenebrous wolf, in contrast, seemed energized by my weakness. It was a whirlwind of aggressive motion, a frenzy of dark attacks. It lunged, and my shadow sword came up to block. But the wolf was no longer interested in the weapon. In a move of shocking, brutal intelligence, it dodged under the shadow blade. It didn't attack the sword. It attacked the swordsman. It threw itself at the main body of my shadow, its elongated jaw of darkness clamping down on my shadow's shoulder. Agony, white-hot and absolute, exploded in my own shoulder. It was a phantom pain so real, so vivid, that my mind accepted it as truth. It felt like 1,000 razors slicing through muscle and grinding on bone. A piercing shriek ripped from my lungs, and I collapsed to my knees, the wooden sword clattering to the sterile white floor. On the wall, my shadow fell with me. The wolf, its jaws still locked on, began to tear. It was a horrifying, silent butchery. It ripped and shredded, pulling away strips of darkness from my shadow's form. And I felt everything. Every tear, every bite. I writhed on the floor of the light box, clutching my shoulder, screaming as I experienced the dismemberment of my own silhouette. My body was physically untouched, but my mind was being tortured with an intimacy that defied all logic. The team in the control room could only watch in frozen horror. Leo was yelling my name, his voice a distorted, panicked plea over the intercom. Graves was shouting orders, but there were no orders to give. This was beyond their control, beyond their science. The wolf was methodical. It was not just killing, it was consuming. My shadow's form on the wall convulsed and twitched, growing fainter, more ragged with every passing second. Its clean, man-shaped outline became a tattered, frayed remnant. I watched, my vision blurring with tears of pain and terror, as the essence of my own reflection was devoured by a monster from another reality. Finally, with one last, violent tear, it was over. My shadow stopped moving. It lay on the floor of the light box, a still, savaged patch of darkness, no longer a silhouette, just a formless, ragged stain. My pain stopped. The screaming agony vanished, replaced by a vast, echoing emptiness that was 1,000 times worse than the simple absence I had felt before. The tenebrous wolf, its form seeming somehow denser, more substantial, stood over its kill. It remained motionless for a long moment. Then, slowly, it turned its featureless face, its predator's gaze, away from the dead shadow on the floor, and seemed to look directly at me, through the walls, through the glass, seeing the source of its meal. It was a look of horrid satisfaction, of a mission accomplished. Then, its form began to lose its cohesion. It dissolved, flowing backward like smoke in a vacuum, retreating to the same corner from which it had first emerged. It poured back into the invisible crack between worlds and was gone. The lightbox was silent. In the center of the room, I lay unconscious on the floor. And a few feet away, a dead, mangled stain of darkness marred the perfect white floor, a grim testament to the battle that had been lost. I floated back to consciousness in the quiet, antiseptic confines of the ARC infirmary. 2 days had passed in a merciful black void. My body ached with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion, but the phantom pain in my shoulder was gone. A new feeling had taken its place. Before, when I first lost my shadow, it was a feeling of absence, of being untethered. Now, it was the raw, undeniable feeling of amputation. A part of me had been violently torn away, and my very soul felt the wound. I was shadowless again, but this was a different, more grievous kind of emptiness. The scientists were in a state of controlled panic. While I was recovering, the lightbox had remained sealed, a crime scene holding a single, bizarre piece of evidence: the corpse of my shadow. For 2 full days, it lay on the floor, a static, ragged blotch of darkness. Some of the team theorized the phenomenon was over. The predator had come, it had hunted, it had won, and it had left. The anomaly was resolved, albeit in the most horrific way possible. On the 3rd day, a junior technician staring at the bank of monitors for the light box, a post now considered a boring but mandatory watch, sat bolt upright in his chair. "We have movement," he said, his voice a choked whisper. Dr. Graves and the others rushed to the main screen. On the pristine white floor of the aperture, the ragged stain of darkness had twitched. Just once. A slight, convulsive shudder. Then, slowly, horribly, the darkness began to pull itself together. With the shuddering, palsied effort of a newborn creature, it rose from the floor. But this was not my shadow. It was no longer a t-shirt and jeans silhouette of Arthur Finch. As it stood, its form began to warp, to stretch. The proportions shifted. The legs bent backward into canine hocks. The torso thinned. The arms elongated into spindly forelimbs. A ripple like a breeze over water moved across its dark surface, a texture that disturbingly resembled fur. The contours of the head stretched forward, melting and reforming into the cruel, elongated shape of a wolf's snout. Watching from a monitor in his office, Dr. Graves's face went white. The blood drained from his face as the horrifying truth dawned on him. He finally understood the wolf's true purpose. "It wasn't a hunt," he breathed, his voice trembling with a mixture of terror and scientific awe. "It was an infection, a replication. The tenebrous wolf hadn't just killed my shadow. It had planted a seed. It had laid an egg. My shadow, my own essential darkness, was metamorphosing. It was becoming another tenebrous wolf. At the exact moment the shadow's transformation began in the lightbox, a violent shudder racked my body in the infirmary. A searing fever spiked my temperature past 104 degrees Fahrenheit. But it was more than just a fever. A profound and terrifying change was taking place in my mind. Waves of pure animalistic rage washed over me, so potent they erased all thought. I snarled, a guttural, inhuman sound that shocked the nurses at my bedside. I thrashed against my restraints, my eyes wild, trying to smash the heart monitor, to bite the hands that tried to soothe me. I was a caged animal. The connection was undeniable, a direct and horrific symmetry. The scientists realized their catastrophic miscalculation. The shadow was merely the first stage of the process, the larval form. Whatever happened to it was a blueprint for what would eventually happen to its host, to me. They moved me from the infirmary to a reinforced observation cell, the kind used for dangerously unstable subjects. The door was thick steel, the window a sheet of bulletproof polycarbonate. They were no longer studying a man with a curious affliction. They were containing a chrysalis, terrified of what was about to emerge. They had locked me away, understanding with dawning, stomach-churning horror that soon the thing they would have to face would not be a man at all. The change was no longer subtle. It was a physical invasion, a hostile takeover of my own biology. My fingernails thickened, hardening and yellowing, their edges curving and sharpening into something that resembled claws. A constant deep ache settled into my teeth as if they were being pushed from their sockets, and my jaw locked and spasmed with excruciating cramps. My skin was perpetually cold, covered in a landscape of goosebumps as if, just beneath the surface, a million tiny hairs were trying to force their way into the open air. My mind was a battlefield. The architect, Arthur Finch, was still in there, a terrified prisoner in his own skull. His memories of coffee, of blueprints, of Leo's laugh, were becoming faded photographs in a storm of primal alien impulses. The overwhelming raw-throated need to hunt. A hunger so profound it was a physical pain. A rage that had no source and no target. The world was being re-rendered through new senses. The smell of the disinfectant in the cell was an aggressive chemical assault. The low hum of the ventilation was a deafening roar. I was losing the war. The man was being submerged, and the beast was rising. In the control room, the atmosphere was funereal. Dr. Kane was silent, his psychological expertise useless against a biological transmutation. It was Dr. Evans, the biologist, who delivered the final devastating diagnosis. He had been feverishly comparing the telemetry from the original Wolf's appearance with my latest blood panels. He suddenly staggered back from his console, his hand flying to his mouth. "Graves!" he shouted, his voice cracking with terror. He pointed a trembling finger at his screen. "Look at the genetic markers. It's not an infection. It's not a virus. It's a full-scale replacement. His DNA is being actively, physically rewritten. This isn't just a pattern, it's a template." The words hung in the air, more terrifying than any curse. I wasn't being turned into a monster. My very being, my human code, was being erased and overwritten with the code of the tenebrous wolf. Panic, cold and professional, rippled through the control room. This was a containment failure of the highest order. They hadn't just studied a monster. They had served as the incubator for a new one. Dr. Graves, his face a grim, stony mask, picked up a red telephone that connected directly to the facility's security command. "Initiate protocol neutralize," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "On my mark." In my cell, the animal rage receded for a brief, lucid moment. The storm in my head cleared, and Arthur Finch had one last moment at the wheel. I stumbled toward the reinforced glass of the observation window, seeking my own reflection, needing to see my own face one last time. But it wasn't my face. The man looking back at me was a grotesque parody. The features were mine, but they were stretched, distorted, as if seen through warped glass. The jaw was longer, the brow heavier, and the eyes... my eyes were gone. In their place were two burning, luminous pools of sickly yellow light, devoid of reason or recognition. I was looking at the monster. I was seeing my new face. This was the final horror. The last spark of my humanity was being forced to witness its own extinction. And then I felt it. The final, definitive push. My consciousness, my sense of self, my entire history was a flickering candle flame in a hurricane. It was being snuffed out, consumed by something ancient, starving, and infinitely patient. My last human thought was not of my life, or of Leo, but of the old man at the gas station, his pale eyes, his quiet, gravelly voice. His words finally made their terrible, perfect sense. May the emptiness that follows come to claim you. The emptiness hadn't just followed me, it had caught me, and now it was inside me. A sound tore from my throat, a sound that was not a scream but a howl, a long, guttural, predatory cry of triumph and hunger that vibrated with such unnatural resonance that hairline fractures bloomed across the polycarbonate window. My body convulsed, bones cracking and reshaping under my skin. The final transformation had begun. Arthur Finch was gone. In his place, the new vessel for the tenebrous wolf stood, its yellow eyes glowing in the dim light of the cell. In the control room, the scientists and soldiers stared in silent, abject terror at the creature on their monitors. The curse wasn't over. The story hadn't ended. It had just entered a new, far more dangerous chapter, one that was about to be unleashed from its cage and into the world, inseparable from the beast he had become.